This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome to the November 2025 episode of RCV Clips, our podcast about all things ranked choice voting. I'm Chris Hughes, a member of the Resource Center staff. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Sally Hudson, Executive Director of Ranked Choice Virginia, former Virginia General Assembly member, and newest RCVRC board member, among other things, about Charlottesville, Virginia's use of PRCV for the first time this year and how it fits into the city's political history writ large. Sally, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you.
So there's a lot of places we could start today, but I'm curious to start with just the history. What are some of the most important things for people to understand about the city of Charlottesville, its history, its legacy, and how its place in Virginia has informed how its elections and how its government work?
Virginia in general, and Charlottesville in particular, are places that pride themselves on being a cradle of democracy. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe are all from the Charlottesville area, so we're really founding fathers central and spend a lot of time thinking about the concept of democracy. But the city of Charlottesville doesn't really become a government unit on its own until after the Civil War. We incorporated after emancipation. And so that's when we really got our voting laws that still have ripple effects to this day. Like a lot of cities that incorporated in that period, we started out with wards or districts that allowed the different parts of the city to have representation. In particular, that meant that newly enfranchised Black men who were congregated in one part of the city and also increasingly European immigrants had some representation on what was then the Board of Aldermen, along with the more affluent white parts of the city. But like a lot of places in the South and really around the country, those wards were dissolved in the 1920s at the height of Jim Crow, when there were more affluent local leaders who wanted to concentrate power in a new political system. So in 1923, the city of Charlottesville moves to all at-large block elections, which would allow the largest voting block in the city to win all the seats in each city council election. And that's the system that we still have to this day. Like a lot of places, especially in Virginia and across the South, there have been campaigns throughout our history to try to go back to wards. The NAACP has really been the leader in that throughout Charlottesville city history. And ultimately, those campaigns have been ineffective. So I think it shows how persistent the at-large block model really can be, because it does allow the political structure to concentrate power in the hands of one voting block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, could you actually expand on that a little bit? It sounds like that's been used now for a century in Charlottesville. Is that right?
That is.
It's a long time to be stuck with one system, especially one designed, in the shadow of Jim Crow. I think the next thing I'm sort of jumping forward to with that structure, that fact of at-large block voting elections being the way Charlottesville works, is a decade ago, the Unite the Right rally took place in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017. How has that shaped Charlottesville politics and culture in that last decade?
Yeah, I think it helps to start to talk about the mechanics of block voting just a little, because if you're not from this part of the country, you may be less familiar. A block voting election just means that when there are 3 seats up on city council, every voter gets 3 votes. If there are 2 seats up on city council, every voter gets 2. So you get to vote for as many people as there are open seats. And in principle, that sounds pretty simple, that everybody gets as many votes as there are seats and the people with the most votes wins. But in practice, what it really means is that the same voters pick all the winners. It's a winner-take-all system. So if the biggest voting block tends to vote for the same 3 people, then that slice of the city is going to pick all the winners. And that is the system that we had for the last century. And it led to a lot of discontent in the city, because it meant that the more affluent north side of the city, which is also the wider part of the city, basically got all the representation on council. And the less affluent part of the city, which had a lot more Black residents, often had very little, if not no, representation on council. Like, we had precincts in the city that had all of one member on council for 60 years. And that finally broke through after Unite the Right in Charlottesville. That was a very tumultuous time politically for our city, where there was a lot of disagreements throughout the residents about how the city handled that event and the fallout afterwards, and a real racial reckoning within the city about what structural justice would look like more broadly. And in the fall of that year, on the heels of the Unite the Right rally, Charlottesville elected our first Black female mayor in the city's history. And she ran a single shot campaign, which was designed to fight back against the problems of block voting. In a single shot campaign strategy, you tell all of your supporters to use only one vote so that they're concentrating all of their power behind one candidate, and they don't run the risk of losing out to a block system. And that was the strategy that ultimately elected Mayor Nakia Walker, who became the first Black female mayor of Charlottesville City. And I think that election really cast a bright light on how block voting really works in practice. It taught a bunch of people that if there is going to be diverse representation on council for all the neighborhoods and all the demographic groups, that they had to fight back against the forces that block voting tend to produce. And so I think that is what really got the community talking about electoral reform that would make it easier for us to have diverse representation by design and not be fighting against our own election system to get there.
Right. I mean, it sounds like the mayor really had to be strategic and thoughtful with how she was approaching that campaign just to get a modicum of power. So I'd be curious for you to unpack a little bit more, like how did that campaign in particular inform the debate over proportional RCV in Charlottesville? What were the sort of things people were taking from that campaign and from Charlottesville's history when they were thinking about what proportional RCV could bring to the residents of Charlottesville?
I think that campaign taught a lot of voters what the city's Black minority voters had long known, which is if you really want to get what you want on council, you have to single shot in a block voting system, because that's the only way that you can concentrate your power behind the one person who you want to see most elected to represent your views. And I think a lot of the white residents of the city hadn't fully understood that in the same way that Black voters had for a very long time. And so it created this more public conversation about how do we have a system that allows people to vote for what they really want and get the representation that they deserve without playing those kinds of strategic games with their vote. And ranked choice voting solves that problem, because on a ranked choice ballot in PRCV, you can just rank the candidates in the order that you like them. And that's the best way to use your vote in the most powerful way. So we really focused in talking about PRCV as a community as solving that voter ballot experience problem. Like, aren't you sick of trying to figure out how to use your vote in the way that's best for you? I think that the broader conversation about how PRCV really works and what proportional representation means has unfolded from there, because I think that we really learned that people know what their experience is like in the ballot box, but American voters are still very unfamiliar with the concept of PR, even in a super highly engaged college town community like this. And so I think that taught us that we had a lot of work to do as a community to even understand where our old system came from, how it really works, and what the potential alternatives look like.
Yeah, I think it's something we see again and again is the way Americans tend to conceptualize politics is in this like winner take all mode. The vast majority of our elections are some kind of winner take all, whether it's single member districts for Congress or it's multi-seat block voting at large. Still winner take all, typically awarding seats to the same people or the same set of voters again and again. And my experience in Portland and from what I've observed in Virginia too is just that cultural part takes time to sort of unearth for people. It's the thing you don't necessarily see clearly because it's what it's the water we swim in, to borrow a phrase.
Yeah.
And not to get ahead of our schedule here, but Our friends at More Equitable Democracy have a podcast called The Future of Our Former Democracy, where they talk a lot about this, about how culture informs politics, especially when you're thinking about Ireland, where they use proportional RCV and have for a long time. And it's just embedded in their culture, and how that also took decades to really catch on.
I think that's right. And I think most Americans' default is a single winner election. So when they find out the rules for that, which is the person with the most votes wins, and then we just copy paste that onto multi-winner elections, they don't really think about how the consequences of that play out across multiple seats.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to talk more about that. But first, I'm curious to hear what happened in Charlottesville this summer. So, proportional RCV was used in the primary in June. Who won, and what do the results of this election tell us about how PRCV works in practice?
So we had two winners in that election. There were two seats up on city council. And I think it was a great example of how proportional representation plays out in practice, because it was a Democratic primary. And our Democratic voters in Charlottesville City really come from two contingents, a more new age progressive wing and a more longstanding moderate wing. And the winners got one of both. We had one candidate who got about half the votes, and she won the first seat. Her name's Jen Fleischer. And we had another candidate who got about 35% of the vote, and he won the other seat. He's the current mayor, Juan Diego Wade. And what we saw is the voters really got half and half on a lot of dimensions of the city. There was one North Side resident and one South Side resident. There was one incumbent and one newcomer. There was one man and one woman. We got one Black member and one white member. So to the extent that two seats can ever allow for proportional representation, I think that the two voting contingents really got their fair share of winners.
That's what you hope to hear. And I want to talk a bit more about some of the limitations of two-seat PRCV as well, but I think we'll have to leave that till one or two questions, because the other thing I'm curious for you to unpack is, what are the big takeaways? What were the wins for PRCV? What are the lessons learned from this cycle?
I think the biggest takeaway that we had, which is a lesson that has been amplified for us by a lot of communities across the country, is that you do have to invest deeply in voter education anytime you're making a change. It's really important that people understand why the change is happening and how it works, because our whole mission as election reformers is to make people feel more empowered at the ballot box. And if they don't understand how the system works or why it's changing, we've fallen short of that goal. I think what we also saw up close in our community is that there is only so much the election administrators themselves can do on that front, because they really have their hands full just with the basic nuts and bolts of administration, especially in a smaller community like Seville, where there isn't a bigger budget to hire public outreach staff. So I think it was really important for there to be a community group like Ranked Choice Virginia out in the community doing the kind of voter education that would engage people. I think what I learned is that our election administrators have deeply professional experience in responding to the kinds of questions that come through the front door of their office, but that is different than being out and about in the community and engaging people who would never even call up the registrar to ask that question. Like, there are voters who are familiar with navigating bureaucracy and feel confident calling up City Hall when they have a question, but there are lots and lots of voters who would never think to do that and don't know how. And so we've got to be out meeting them where they're at. And those are just not resources that EOs have in their budget or frankly in their experience set. Public outreach is just a different professional toolkit. So having that partnership was great. And we learned a lot about that from our partners in Portland. I think the other big thing that we learned, and we took this advice from our friends in Minnesota, is that the candidates are the most important vector of voter education because they talk to more voters than everybody. They are out there knocking doors and going to all the town halls and the barbecues. And so spending the time to make sure that the candidates feel really confident talking about ranked choice is also important. And making sure that they feel supported with materials that they can kind of grab off the shelf and throw on their mail or add to their website, so that it's not a heavy lift for them to do it, because their first job is to get themselves elected. They have a lot on their plate already too. And so a really important role that the community groups can play is making it easy for them to do good ranked choice education.
If you want to hear even more about that, Grace Ramsey from Democracy Rising was just on the last episode of the podcast and talking about that same set of dynamics of election officials have sort of like really broad, high level reach. They tend to have relationships with the local reporters, if there are any. Ideally there are, but not a guarantee in this current media environment. They have those pre-existing relationships with council members, with folks who are sort of like bigger voices in the community. But when you're working on a reform like this, where you're trying to bring more people into the fold who maybe have historically been excluded from elections and from power, that means the existing structures of like information are probably already not super well built to reach those folks. So you need those community organizations to come in and know who to talk to in those neighborhoods, who can then go spread that message as well. And, to really hammer home your point, the candidates, they're talking to the most people. They are absolutely the clearest way to get the most information out. And then, we come back to the conversation about culture. The culture of your politics informs how people are going to campaign. And RCV reforms are geared towards changing the culture of your politics. So ideally, your candidates are approaching it with that same culture and that mindset of power sharing, proportional representation, rather than a winner take all, drag everybody down with me mindset. But that takes work to move things along.
And we were fortunate to have some really positive candidates running who leaned into the system because it was just their nature. They really liked being out there in the community and saying, you can vote for me first or him second, or I'd love to earn your second vote. Like they embraced the opportunity to say really nice things about each other, which we hear a lot from ranked choice places. I think the other thing that we've heard loud and clear from election administrators in both Arlington and Charlottesville is that it is not appropriate for them as election officers to be explaining why the city adopted a reform. And that is the most important question that voters have, which is, why is this happening? What was wrong with the old way? What are we trying to fix? And that kind of subjective policy advocacy is not something that EOs do. And so we need to have community groups there who can talk about the history and talk about how we got there and answer the question why in a really rich and community rooted way, because it's natural for voters to ask. And if we don't provide a good answer, they're going to be mistrustful for all the right reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if it's, I think we're going to experience this in DC. Voters voted for RCV and primary reform pretty heavily, 73-27 citywide, but its implementation starts next year. Voters need to be reminded what the campaign was about and why. And that will have to come from those local groups, because voters, it just makes them have more trust in the system if there's a reason for why it's changing. Can you now just talk us through it from your perspective? What has proportional RCV helped resolve or begun resolving in Charlottesville? And at the same time, what remains to be done? What additional work is necessary to really address some of the core issues that proportional RCV is designed to address?
I think the most important thing that our PRCV pilot did is it taught people how our old system really worked. I think that's what I learned in doing voter education, is that people didn't have a name or a language for describing what block voting even was or what the problems were with it. There were some voters who understood intuitively, after years of underrepresentation, what was wrong with it and that single shotting was their best path. But we as a community did not have a really well-developed language for explaining what that problem was and what potential fixes were. And I think that sometimes, just because voters are busy and there's a lot of news to keep track of, they don't really clue in on those details until there's an active election going on and they have to learn a new system. So if all the pilot did was teach more people what our old system really was, it would be a success from my perspective. The fact that it also got us election results that really do reflect the range of views in the community to the to the extent that two winner can, I think it's fabulous as a path forward for our city. But there are way more than two different stripes of voters in Charlottesville. I think that we've got 3 or 4 or even more meaningful voter blocks throughout the city. And so I think that's why the long-term conversation here now is about what does the reform of our city council look like more generally? Do we need more seats? Should we be electing more winners at a time so that we can allow those different slices of the city to have meaningful representation?
So on that note, this is, to me, one of the bigger shifts in moving to a proportional representation, power sharing system. You give more seats to more people, you get more voices represented. I think the fear we hear from people is, well, what if I think that group over there having power, having representation on council is dangerous in some way, is potentially harmful to me, to my neighbors, to our democracy. How do you think about that? How do you conceptualize that when you're talking about PR?
I think one of the other things that we found really helpful in talking with voters was distinguishing between single winner and multi-winner offices.
Yeah.
That if you are electing an independent executive whose job it is to preside over the whole city, then finding the majority winner who people can come to consensus around is the right standard. But when you are electing a multi-member legislative body, you want both majority rule and minority voice. You want that body to reflect the range of views in the community so that they can all come together and have productive conversations about what the needs of the city are. And I think drawing that distinction between executive and legislative was very important for people to understand why both single and multi-winner RCV exist. There are 5 seats on council. Why shouldn't a community that represents 25% of the people have at least one of those 5 seats? And I think it's really hard to defend against that. Like, if you're really arguing that people should be underrepresented, then you can't possibly be trying to speak on behalf of the will of the voters. And I do think that it was mostly a matter of education, of even bringing to light what the old system really did, because I did feel like even some of our city councilors didn't understand the history and of how they got elected. So I think if we can be patient in those conversations and we can work through those concepts, we can get where we are trying to go in the long run. Because I do think that proportional representation is a really new idea to a lot of Americans, even really highly educated folks, even folks who are otherwise really deep in election law. They just haven't really thought about what fair share politics looks like.
Yeah, 100%. I think that will remain the biggest point of conversation with folks as PR advocacy grows is, well, what will this look like? And honestly, to get super philosophical about it, in a very individualistic culture like the United States, that the concept of power sharing, I think, gets at there's like just some tension there. And I'm very curious to continue to see that play out over the next few years.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great note to end things on. Thank you so much, Sally, for joining us today and for all your work in Charlottesville.
Absolutely. We could not have done it without the Ranked Choice Resource Center. You have been with us every step of the way.
Our pleasure. And now for this month's final round, where we share an interesting bit of trivia, a useful tidbit, or just something we thought was cool for folks to know about ranked choice voting. Here's Matt Ruberg with this month's final round.
Did you know that the city of St. Paul used RC Tab to produce their RCV results for the first time this November? Ramsey County, which runs RCV elections for St. Paul, used to hand count the city's RCV elections. But this year, in collaboration with RCV-RC, they approved RC Tab for use in St. Paul elections and generated accurate, round-by-round RCV results on election night. Rapidly creating results like this helps build trust in election results. This automation achievement makes it this month's final round.
Thank you for joining us today for the November 2025 episode of RCV Clips, produced by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. Make sure to subscribe to the show for the latest episodes and updates. Please take a minute to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform, too. For more information about RCVRC and ranked choice voting, check out our website, www.rcvresources.org. The production of this podcast is supported by the generosity of our donors. Donations can be made directly on the website. Please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions at donate@rcvresources.org. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at RCV Resources, and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at RCVRC. Our theme music is Flutterbee by Poddington Bear. Until next time, I'm Chris Hughes on behalf of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center.